It has been over 5 years since we last installed a Sungrow inverter. Mark and I have just come back from the factory in China, and I think we're going to end that dry spell.
Okay, so Yorick, this is one of our normal reviews where we test the heck out of an inverter and pull it to pieces, right? This is more about our impressions of the factory and the change of attitude, I guess, we've had towards Sungrow. I think today in the Australian market, there is a lot more Sungrow fanboys than there are Fronius fanboys in the market.
I have to agree with you. It's a very popular product.
You know what camp I'm still sitting in.
Fronius is always.
But to be fair, I kind of, after spending a lot of time looking more into the Sungrow battery today and inverter, I'm a little bit more impressed, and I can kind of see why there's such a following.
Okay, what's that?
So there's 7 points that are, before we get into the factory tour, I want to really go through quickly. Look, I've got written down here, it can harness more than 200% power. Can you explain what that's about?
Yeah, so let's say we've got a 10 kilowatt inverter. We can throw 20 kilowatts of panels on that. We can push both 10 kilowatts to the house or grid and at the same time charge the battery at its full capacity. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, so quite often on an inverter, you'll only be able to, if you've got 20 kilowatts of solar, it's middle of the day, you can only harness 10 kilowatts out of it. So yeah, that is kind of quite an impressive feature. There's a couple of things that I like about it. It's got AFCI, which is the arc fault circuit interruption, which is just a safety thing in case you get a burnt out plug.
Yeah, but it's actually more of an exception to the rule in the Australian market. Not everybody's got it, and Sungrow has it by default and turned on by default.
Turned on by default. So obviously they've tuned that in because you can get nuisance tripping on that.
Yeah.
It's got a global maximum power point tracker, which I think is a big deal if you've got a partially shaded roof. You can get a lot more energy out of your solar panels.
Yeah,
because it's kind of like a gearbox for the inverter, right? That so it doesn't get tripped up with shaded situations.
Sure.
Now, fast charge and discharge. Tell us about that.
So yeah, look, basically you can get the full 10 kilowatt charge and discharge out of a 10 kilowatt inverter or bigger system. High current connection with the battery. So yeah, essentially you're not limited by the battery size as to how much power you can get out of it, really.
It's got 4 MPPTs, which Fronius generally have avoided doing that, and I think that's for reasons of efficiency, but 4 MPPTs really makes it easy for the designer and installer.
It does. There's a lot of Chinese inverters have many MPPTs in comparison to what they used to, but 4 is actually quite a lot, even on a hybrid inverter especially.
And to dumb that down a little bit, basically 4 MPPTs means you can have 4 groups of panels that are uneven, and you bring them down into different trackers.
Basically 4 strings.
Yeah. 30 kilowatt hour battery stacks or 40 kilowatt hour battery stacks.
Yeah. So big battery stack. So I mean, 30 is not as big as some other brands, but 30 kilowatts of a high voltage battery on single phase, 35 to 40 on 3-phase, depending on the inverter model, which look, it beats what we're currently offering with something like BYD, but I think it fits really nicely with the battery rebate as of May 1st.
Sure. So it's got frequency shifting. And now what this really means is, let's say you've got a good old 6.6 kilowatt system, a 5 kilowatt inverter on your house from 10 years ago.
Yeah.
You want us to come along and put another 10 kilowatts on top of it. So we put a 10 kilowatt Sungrow inverter on it and leave your old system staying on there. That's all fine. We can do that. With frequency shifting, it means the Sungrow inverter can basically talk to the other inverter in a blackout situation and keep your old 6.6 kilowatt system running.
Yeah, something you see a lot on AC coupled battery systems, not that common on DC coupled offerings.
Now, the last one is a big one, mate. So when we were over in the factory, this was pretty cool. So good old Scooter, Scott Sue, brought us into this little room in this testing facility. And there's just stuff like all over the wall, like
the testing room. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, not much bigger than this room. And he was like, guys, I've got something to show you. Can you see the gateway?
Yes, and so we were looking for this big box because that's what we would expect. We've seen Tesla gateways, the like. And
meanwhile, these other like 3 engineers came walking in. They're sort of standing there real smug. Can you find it?
They were obviously proud of what they managed. So basically, it was a 4-pole smart meter, main switch, and island and contactor in one for full home backup. And it was tiny. I was very impressed.
Yeah, so to explain that another way, okay, so with the Tesla gateway is kind of the traditional gateway, right?
Correct.
It's this big box that you put on the wall as a separate, Sig Energy has the same kind of thing. And it's got some smarts in there, and it separates you from the electricity grid in case of blackout. So you're not sending power back and firing the Energix worker or something, you know?
And it's your consumption monitoring. But I think the big takeaway is you have to take the power or the main supply out of the switchboard through the gateway and then back into the switchboard.
So Sungrow decided they're not going to, well, basically they are going to reinvent the wheel, right? get rid of that big old clunky box. And what they've done is instead of, this is the way we do it with Fronius. So show us a single phase setup.
So actually I might turn to this camera here.
Yep.
Okay, so on a single phase setup, basically what we've got is we've got the main switch, we've got a consumption meter, we've got a protection circuit for the relay, and then contactor. Now what Sungrow have managed to do is basically cram all of this in something the size of this. And so basically that becomes your main switch, consumption meter, and your island and contactor in one unit. And now you can still do, it's only for full home backup. So
in other words, if you want to back up your whole house in the case of a blackout.
That's correct. Yeah. So that's specifically for full home backup. Now they will still have the internal contactor inside the inverter for partial backup or full home backup. But this definitely is a big advantage if your inverter is away from your switchboard. So I was very impressed.
So one thing I really like about that is we've got like 4 different brands of gear there.
Correct.
That can fail, and we have to wire all those in, and there's just a potential of having a problem with that, and it takes a lot of work.
It does.
And the warranty goes back to all these different, you can get contactors that fail. So the warranty, we could be chasing IMO or whoever it might be.
This is one just here. I mean, that's literally our Maven.
Yeah, exactly. This is the setup if you've got 3-phase, right? So much bigger. And if the Sungrow 3-phase gateway, as they're calling it, or mini gateway. Actually, they had another different name for it, but it's a mini gateway, is basically that size. So we're getting rid of all of this space inside your switchboard, and much simpler to wire up. And there's one place to go back for the warranty. Yeah. I reckon that is.
And there's only one cable between the inverter and the gateway too. It's just an like a Cat6 cable.
Exactly, yeah. So it's really simplified it, and I'm a little bit jealous of the Sungrow fanboys for that one. They have had this other thing they called a gateway before. It wasn't exactly the same as this.
Yeah.
So this was a real new reveal. They said we were allowed to talk about it.
Yeah.
But we weren't allowed to show pictures of it or anything like that.
Well, hopefully we might get a test sample to install at some point.
On the first one that we're testing, we're hoping we're going to get one for that. So that'll be interesting.
Fingers crossed. Yeah.
Anyway, I think we've raved on too much about that. Sounds like I'm turning into a Sungrow fanboy. But talking about fanboys, you know what I don't like about it?
What?
It doesn't have a fan. So no, quite seriously though, one thing that I do like about Fronius is the cooling, and I think it's essential in power electronics.
Yeah, especially for something that's running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and hopefully going to last many, many years.
Yeah, 15, 20 years, not just a 10-year warranty period, maybe 25 years, So, so fan cooling is only on their, I think, 20 or 25 kilowatt inverters, so they don't do that. I am really interested to get one side by side and comparison test it downstairs. Quite often when I compare, almost every time when I compare it to Fronius to another inverter, the Fronius runs at least 10 degrees cooler.
Okay.
Which they say doubles its lifetime in the rule of thumb for power electronics.
Sure.
So there's a lot of other things, like I haven't tested the AFCI, which we normally test. I've sometimes almost burnt down the room doing that. the global maximum power
Welcome,
point.
Michael.
So a lot of these things are on paper. We are going to do the full review in the coming months, right?
Yeah, it's in the works. Well, look, let me just take you a little bit through some of the history of Sungrow. So we've been to the factory. Sungrow is now the world's biggest inverter supplier, and I think also battery, like utility battery supplier now on the market. They had an annual turnover last year of almost 20 billion Australian dollars.
Yeah, right.
It is huge. I mean, there's not BYD big, but it's getting up there.
Yeah.
It is big. Now, it was founded in 1997, so they've been around for quite a long time. They had their IPO, but basically became publicly listed in 2011, and shortly afterwards came into Australia in 2012. And then I think someone contacted you from Sungrow.
Yeah, so it was 2012. We'd only been in business 4 years or something like that at that stage.
Yeah.
And I was actually working from a unit that I was renting just across the way there. And Andy called me, who was a legend from Sungrow back in the day.
Yeah.
And was like, "Oh, can you do our warranty work?" And I'm like, "Sure, who's Sungrow?" And then like within a week, we just get this pallet of inverters turn up for us to, and I've never seen 10 inverters in one pallet in my life, Like, this is real early days, right? So we started doing their warranty work, and we had a really good relationship. Andy was such a good manager. And so we would go out to, I think it was Green Engineering or something like that, the company, this really chunky company, that we would go and do warranty work for them.
Okay.
The installers had totally screwed up the system. There was water ingress in the isolator, or just basically the installer had stuffed up. We were going out, we were charging Sungrow to go out to fix up this thing. Sungrow weren't even charging it onto the sales company or the installer that had screwed it up.
Well, they were just getting it fixed.
And I was complaining to Andy, and it's like, look, mate, this is why you get a good reputation.
Yeah.
And just look after your customers, So I actually learned a lot from Andy back in the days.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I mean, I started MC Electrical back in 2015, and I started as service manager. My number one job was sorting out the Sungrow warranty claims. Now, these weren't a lot of our installs. These were predominantly other installer systems, but we were the Brisbane service partner. And so actually I have my start partly to thank to Sungrow.
And you had that same kind of experience with Robin back in the day.
I did, yeah. So look, I mean, I used to try and keep on top of everything, but if I was more than a couple of days behind schedule with my warranty replacements, I used to get a phone call from Robin going, "Yorick, why is this taking so long?" And that actually really blew me away, because I'd done warranty work for brands like ABB, Samuel, and no one has ever chased me up about a warranty claim, except it was me chasing them up for payment.
Now, through that period, sort of 2015 to 2020, we would install some Sungrow inverters, but it really was kind of the budget inverter at that stage. It didn't have great consumption monitoring. I didn't love it as an inverter, but I knew how good they were at service, and I knew they weren't going to screw us around. So we installed maybe 10 or 20% of our systems were Sungrow.
Yeah.
There came a turn around about 2020.
It was with the 8 kilowatt inverter they brought out. It was sort of the first time we were starting to sell systems that were bigger than a 5 kilowatt single phase Sungrow. And we had problems with export limiting, where we had to set a 5 kilowatt export limit. It was often dropping to 0, and there was no great software solution for that. The other thing too was we started having some bit of a headaches with dealing with the warranties. We were no longer the Brisbane service partners at that time, but I think actually trying to get hold of somebody at Sungrow became very difficult.
Yeah. It got a little bit annoying and frustrating, especially for Shane, my service manager, who's still here. One day he said, kind of in jest to me, "Can we just get rid of Sungrow and only do Fronius?" And I'm like, "Yep." And we did.
And we did. Yeah.
That's when we turned to 100% Fronius from that day.
Yeah. And I think we dodged a little bit of a bullet at the time, because there actually was a couple of known problems, especially in that generation of Sungrow inverter. There was a Panasonic relay which apparently fails very regularly. So we actually missed a lot of that headache.
Yeah, exactly. And there was that early battery, was it the SBR or something? The one that hung on the wall. They had a lot of issues with that. I heard
SPB, I think it was.
Whatever it is, yeah. So that first generation of Sungrow batteries I had issues with. So I kind of think we did dodge a bullet. And you know what? You know what I'm like, Yorick. I'm a bit of a fair weather friend when it comes to inverter manufacturers.
You are.
So I turned on them, of course. So started bagging out on Sungrow. In just maybe not too harshly, but you know what I mean. I kind of dropped them like a bad idea.
Well, they're obviously not Fronius, because you'd never do that to Fronius, would you, Mark?
To be fair, I have, right? I've bagged Fronius out in their fans and stuff like that. There's just not too much to bag them out on. So
sure. Okay.
Oh, right. But yeah, so I kind of turned on them, but I think over the last couple of years, it came really evident to me that the industry, and my mates in the industry who were installing Sungrow, just started really rating them, especially their customer service. I started talking a little bit more to Scott Sue, because Scott Sue from Sungrow is just a genius.
Oh, he's an absolute legend.
And anytime I've got a technical question about life or something like that, call up Scott Sue.
Oh, I don't even think the phone rang, and he already picked up the phone when we called him just before.
Yeah, he's a bit of a legend. But and so we started softening towards it. And last time, the short of it is, we went over to China a couple of weeks ago, and we're like, "Scott, can we come to your factory?" And he opened the doors for us.
Yeah, well, he was actually there, so we got a full private tour. It was really impressive, and I actually think we should get into some of the things that we were most impressed with at Sungrow. Look, I might start off with, a lot of these manufacturers talk about their C&I applications. So this is commercial and utility or industrial scale batteries. One of the things we got to see at Sungrow that blew me away was their 5 megawatt hour battery pack. So these are used for basically utility, so power grid level battery storage. These are full size shipping containers that they're cramming full of batteries. It's got inbuilt inverters, and I felt like I was walking to a rail yard. I thought, okay, maybe there'd be 1 or 2 production lines, but it was 6 production lines all on a row, each of which had something like 24 or 26 containers on the line at a time.
Yeah, they can pump out something like 150 containers
Yeah.
of batteries, battery containers. So they plonk that container onto a property somewhere, and that becomes grid support, right? So
It's not a property. This is a power station. I mean, these aren't for your mum and dad's
exactly.
little warehouse.
I was right. I wanted one in the backyard.
Yeah. It'll run the aircon all night, put it that way. But also we got to see them actually assembling the modules that go in. So these big container batteries, they've basically got many of these 100 or more kilowatt hour battery racks essentially mounted in them, each of which would have, I don't know, was it 64 of these big, or maybe even more than that. Yeah, 320 kilowatt hour cells. So just watching that process, we've seen a few like small scale demonstrations of this, say at Farway and even at something like Solax, but Sungrow's was just completely next level.
Yeah, it was absolutely next level. What, by the way, when we say containers, we mean shipping containers, right? The 40-foot or the 20-foot shipping containers, and then they had smaller ones than that as well.
Yeah.
Really impressive. We also went up to the PCB or printed circuit board assembly line where they get the printed circuit board and put all the components into it.
Yeah.
Fully automated. We've been to a few of those assembly lines, and we'll put some B-roll up here, and see how it looks all pristine, all showroom-like, shiny and glossy.
Yep.
That's what it was like.
It really was. I mean, we sort of spoke a bit in our Fox talk that, it felt like a real factory. It was a bit grimy, but going to Sungrow, it was like a hospital. It was spotless, and it was huge and clinical, but I reckon there is very high quality controls.
Really high level of automation.
Yeah.
We went downstairs then to the inverter assembly line. Again, really impressive. When you get to inverter assembly lines, you do start to have some people on the line.
You have to, yeah.
And then they went into a testing chamber where they tested it for, I don't know, 4 hours or something like that.
It depended a bit on the model, but yeah, I think it was sort of 2 to 4 hours. But these, unlike some of the other factories we went to, these had a much more sophisticated setup where they literally had racks of them. There was almost like they call it a blackout factory or dark factory or dark warehouse where it's all being done automatically. The inverters come in, they get sorted out on the shelf by a machine, and then they're coming out the other end fully tested, and anything that fails in the process gets rejigged and repaired.
And interestingly, they said something like 2 or 3% of them had a failure, so they would have been dead on arrival if they just shipped them right. So
actually, yeah.
So they had to go back and rework a little plug or whatever it is. So I kind of thought that was interesting. So yeah, I think that was quite eye opening. I mean, I've been to factories before. I've been to a lot of factories before. I would say, hands down, this was the most impressive inverter factory.
Yeah.
You haven't been to Fronius, but I rate it higher than Fronius.
I believe you. Yeah.
In the scale and the automation and everything like that.
It made all the other factories we went and saw look like amateurs. I mean, in a way that they just were above and beyond in terms of their organization. Also what really impressed me is just this sheer amount of volume or space they have dedicated to testing. Because, we've been to a few factories now where they have a dedicated testing area, but they had a dedicated testing factory or multiple dedicated testing factories. It was warehouses of testing equipment.
Yeah. So we went into this EMF acoustic room, like a soundproof room sort of thing, a massive soundproof room, where they're just trying to make sure that their inverters don't put out any frequencies that will disturb any equipment.
Yeah.
And you know what? It reminded me that back in 2012, 2013, right in the early days, I remember Andy sent me out to almost Toowoomba, an hour or two away.
Sure.
And because this old guy had a Sungrow inverter on there that was interfering with his ham radio or something like that. And we spent ages trying to work out what that was, but it's good to know. So I don't think they'll have those problems anymore.
So you're telling me Sungrow spent $6 million on an EMF testing facility for that one customer?
I think that's why they did it, yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, the other thing too was we got to see, I mean, obviously they go through the, testing inverter components, but what we did get to see and was brushed on at other factories we went to, but actually going through and fire testing with the battery packs and testing the safety of them. The thing that battery fire safety is one of the key issues that most customers I talk to about. That's their biggest concern is what happens if there's a fire or something goes wrong. Now, going through this facility, which was through a third party, but where they're literally putting arc welders onto these big battery cells, like this, basically putting an arc welder on, forcing it to catch light, and then seeing how far that propagates. That gave me a lot of confidence in the safety of these battery cells.
Yeah, me and Tak were walking around. That Tak, by the way, was with us. He's my apprentice that does a lot of testing with me.
Yeah.
And he's from Malaysia, and he turns out he speaks Chinese. So he was our translator the whole way, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
But me and Tak were walking around there going, oh man, can we get a job here? This looks so much fun. They're just blowing up batteries and, puncturing batteries and stuff like that. It was,
and
they didn't drag us away. So.
You know what I thought? Even though it was only a small part of it, some of the temperature testing, so like degradation testing in high temperature conditions, they had a dedicated facility or part of the factory which was trying to figure out how much these battery cells would degrade if they're getting too hot, which I think is a really key thing, especially in the current battery market where we're often discussing the pros and cons of high voltage batteries like that's in a Sungrow or BYD, for example, and other brands like Anker or SIG or iStore, for example.
Yeah, and I wish we could show you footage of this. Like there's that famous BYD PS test, which is very clinical lab conditions.
Yep. It's in the showroom, yeah.
This was dirty because they'd been blowing up batteries everywhere.
It smelled like
I had the ash on his face and stuff like that. Not quite, but it was a real serious testing place where they just push these batteries to the extreme.
Yeah, and look, the reason they have this whole facility and what they were telling us is every time there is a change, either it's a battery chemistry change or if it's a design change, or even if it's just been more than a month since they did the last test, they're going through and testing each one of their battery systems at least once a month or more regularly, depending on if there's been an alteration.
And tell us about what they were saying about them setting the standard for the industry. Like, it was a bit of a brag.
It was a brag, but I can believe it. So because these are all being heavily certified by Sungrow, they're saying some of their suppliers actually advertise that because they're certified by Sungrow, they meet a high safety standard, like TÜV, for example, and EUV. So I think there's a little bit of truth to that, but
I think so. Once you see all of the testing facilities they have, we didn't see all of them. The extent that we saw, you're like, far out, these guys have it nailed in, haven't they? So.
What did you think about their monsoon testing? So we got in the car, went to a completely different factory, and this was then we had this huge outdoor area with panels mounted on like cabled mounting systems, and there was what looked like a giant wall of fans.
There was these fans that were like this big, but there was a whole wall of them. I reckon, I don't know, 3 stories, right?
I think so, yeah.
By, I don't know, 20 meters long or something like that. This massive fan system that they put up against their containers. And what was the point of that? Just to make sure nothing
it just
came loose.
Yeah, pretty much just so no doors popped open or, just trying to simulate really harsh weather conditions.
Because sometimes they dump these battery containers in the desert or something like that, where they're just going to get smashed with monsoon winds and they want to make sure nothing's wrong. So they simulate it with massive fans. They had this massive pit where they would blow up containers and then they might have to flood it with water.
Yeah.
So the container from a shipping container would sit in this pit that they would then fill with water in case of disaster.
Well, yeah, look, they're not taking safety. So they're taking safety seriously and they're doing all of these tests and they can show us the tests that they've been doing. And we're not sort of going, oh, well, there's a picture of it. We actually got to be where they do that test.
So I guess, Yorick, that the takeaway that I got from this anyway is that Sungrow is not just some other Chinese inverter. They came into the market small. They kind of proved their presence in Australia. They got a good reputation thanks to guys like Andy and Robin and Scott Sue. And
but they're not small. I mean, they are the biggest inverter manufacturer now in the world.
Yeah, exactly. So and you can really see the level of attention of detail of testing, the precision in the manufacturing. It really was an impressive factory. And I think that's why we're going to take it seriously when we start testing. You've got a couple of jobs that you've sold that we want to install and test these products, do round trip efficiency testing and everything.
Yeah, so we're going to end the dry spell. We're going to install at least a couple of Sungrow systems now. And basically we're going to take it through its paces, do a round trip efficiency and do a proper review in the next coming months.
Anyway, so stay tuned for that one and we'll catch you next time.
Catch you next time.